Welcome everyone to today's blue tongue virus update. Hello, good afternoon to anyone that's joining us live, and also welcome to anyone that might be listening back at a later date. I'm your chair today. My name is Leah Shanks. I'm a Senior Engagement Manager for Beef and Lamb at the AHDB. We've had a slight change to our agenda this afternoon. We were due to be joined by a vet from the Netherlands. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, that won't be happening, but pleased to say we've got Rudolf Reichel from the Animal Plant Health Agency, Head of Exotic Disease, Small Ruminant Expert Group Lead, who's going to give us the picture in Europe instead. And we've got Gordon Hickman from Defra, who is Head of Exotic Disease Policy, also giving us an update. We're hoping that the vet from the Netherlands would pre-record or record an update for us, which we can disseminate as soon as we've got it. So if you've joined today or you're listening back on YouTube, there should be a short video from the Netherlands at some point as well. Like I said, we'll share that. So I'll just go through a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So again, thank you for joining us. We are recording this webinar and the link will be circulated within the next 24 hours and uploaded to YouTube for you to share as you wish. This is a technical update and we have the next webinar lined up already for the 4th of September. If anything happens in the meantime, we will be sure to bring you updates and be updating the Ruminant Health and Welfare Group website when needed. We will hear from our speakers first, and there will be an opportunity to answer some of your questions afterwards. We stress some. There are a lot of you that have joined us today. We only have the hour. If we don't get through your questions, we will try to answer them via the Ruminant Health and Welfare Group website. Please pop your questions in the chat as we go. There is a chat function on my screen. It's to the top right, and you can just enter them on there. If you have any audio problems this afternoon, there is also a troubleshooting guide. You click on materials. So again, that should appear as a piece of paper with a paperclip, and there's a PDF document in there. Like I said, we're recording, so if you do get into any difficulty, you can just listen back in about 24 hours. Just to say as well, once we're finished, we will circulate a feedback form. We'd be really grateful if you could take a couple of minutes to fill in that feedback form with any constructive criticism, ideas, suggestions you might have. Perhaps you've got some topics or suggestions for future webinars and how we can make this as useful for you as possible. Thank you. Next slide, just signposting to some resources that are available. The most up-to-date place for your updates is the Ruminant Health and Welfare website. The QR code on screen will take you there, or you can type into your search engine Ruminant Health and Welfare Blue Tongue, and there you'll find a whole host of resources, FAQs, clinical signs, anything that you might need in relation to blue tongue and the current picture. We are also operating a blue tongue hotline here at AHDB on 024 7771 0386. If you look on the blue tongue page on the Ruminant Health and Welfare website, and perhaps you've got a question you can't find an answer, or it might be quite personalized to your farm perhaps, or a client's farm, and that hotline is there for you. We would like to help you as much as we can. Please do get in touch. Next slide, please, is an information leaflet which is available to download again from the Ruminant Health and Welfare website. Again, it's got clinical signs on there, signposting to places where you can get support and guidance. Perhaps if you're joining and you're a vet today, it might be one to download and print and share with your clients or pop up in your practice. And then finally, for housekeeping, I wanted to share with you some additional support that is available. I'm going to leave this slide up for the next 10 seconds or so. Might be worth taking a photo. You might not need any support right now, but you never know in the future. It might be something for you. Okay, thank you. So we are going to start with Gordon Hickman then, again from Defra, Head of Exotic Disease Policy, and he's going to give us the current picture in the UK. Thanks, Gordon.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting me back. This will just be a very short session, very similar to the one I gave it, I think, about a month ago, but really just the latest situation and thinking. Rudolf will be going through some of the more detail from what we know about the situation in Europe, and we'll pick up questions right at the end. So next slide, please. So you know a lot about this. There's been no change to the, and this time I've sort of split it into the 23-24 season, which, as far as we're concerned, has now ended. So you know the first case was confirmed in November. We had a number of cases in infected animals, mainly cattle, a few sheep, on a number of different premises. I think for that outbreak season, all of them were detected through surveillance, and none of them showed any apparent clinical signs. And of course, that's in stark contrast to what we're finding in continental Europe and why we're so concerned about this disease. All those zones have now been lifted, as you know, and the seasonal vector low period has been and gone. So we're very much into what might happen in 2024-25. There's still no evidence of circulation of bluetongue-free or any other bluetongue serotypes in our midge population, but the risk has changed and continues to increase. So where we sit of today, and you'll hear why from Rudolf in a minute. So the risk of incursion of infected midges, so this is blowing across from continental Europe, was actually medium last week. That means it occurs regularly. That's the first time that we'd had that increased risk from continental Europe. It had previously been very low or negligible. So that was a change last week. We don't know what it'll be this week yet. It may have gone back to low again, or it may still be that level. But I think because of what's going on in continental Europe, the overall risk of a new incursion is now high. So that means an event occurs very often. And if we do get an outbreak here in our domestic livestock, then the risk of onward transmission is now very high, and that's a combination of the temperatures. That would be in those high risk southern and eastern counties. The risk is probably only high in the rest of GB, because conditions are not quite so favourable there. Next slide, please. So just a reminder, we do have this offer of free testing in those 5 high-risk counties, and those are the ones at most risk from the known cases in Northern Europe. But increasingly, and if disease spreads still further through France, then some of those southeastern coast counties will fall more into the high-risk area, and we'll think about whether we need to extend the free testing into those areas. But at the moment, it's in those 5 counties. Please take advantage of it. It's for your benefit or your client's benefit, and it'll just reassure ourselves that there isn't undisclosed disease being transmitted to the rest of GB. Next slide, please. So again, you've seen this before. There are various posters and leaflets, and in addition to all of the fantastic resources on the Ruminant Health and Welfare website, but really it's a question of stay vigilant and be particularly vigilant now. The risk has definitely increased, and it's be aware. So know what those clinical signs are. If you're a vet, talk to your client. If you're a farmer, talk to your vet. Look at the resources that are out there. Perhaps think about signing up to disease alerts, where you'll get to hear more. And very much, this is really aimed at keepers in the main, but be prepared. Know what would happen if you do become an infected premises, or you're in one of these zones that we've spoken about before. please register all your temporary land associations and any short-term lets or buildings. Much easier and quicker to do any surveillance that we may need to do, and make sure that we can track and trace any animals that may be associated with an infected premises. And just that reminder, we say it every time, but source responsibly. So whether that be asking whoever's providing those animals from a high risk county, have you had a free test done? Can you reassure me that at the point of testing they were negative? And think carefully about where you're importing animals from. You obviously won't be able to import from affected countries, but if those animals have to transit an affected country to get to here, there's that increased risk. So just think carefully and talk to your vet about sourcing healthy stock, and that also means donor animals for germinal products, for example. Next slide, please. And I think that's the end.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Gordon. On the risk of incursion, you use the terms regularly and very often. Could you just define those for us, please?
That's the best description you'll get. I mean, we use the phrases high, medium, and low. People then say, well, how do you describe that? So that's why we try and use some of that language. Just to we're not saying any sort of percentages. We're not saying it's probable or very likely or anything. It's just a standard World Organization for Animal Health terminology in terms of looking at those risk levels.
Thank you.
And that's it. I can take any short questions, although it might be worth just listening to what Rudolf's got to say about the position in Northern Europe, and then we can perhaps pick up things at the end. But I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Gordon. We'll pass over to Rudolf then. Rudolf Reichel from the Animal Plant Health Agency, Small Ruminant Expert Group Lead. Thank you.
Just move my camera again. Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you also for the opportunity. So I'll just give a brief update on the blue tongue situation in Europe as we could find it online. So next slide, please. So the main sources would be publications and websites that's available online, and a few inputs from APHA and Defra advisors. And please keep in mind, situation changes sometimes rapidly, and things may be out of date by the time we report it here or look at it, but we'll try our best to say where things have changed. So just a reminder of the geography there, where the United Kingdom is and England, and we've got our susceptible coastal counties south and to the east, lying close to the Netherlands, and Belgium and France. And then it also shows where Luxembourg is and Germany, where there also have been cases. Next slide, please. So in summary, the first BTV3 reported case for 2024 was in the Netherlands on the 17th of June, but then they now get about 300 to 500 further cases per week reported. Similar situation in Germany, also cases in Belgium and Luxembourg, with cases very near to France. And we've just had the first confirmed case right in northern France, right on the border. That was on the 30th of July, was reported yesterday. The virus circulating is identical to that was present in 2023. Some cases, unfortunately, are near the channel, which obviously increased the risk to us. And as Gordon mentioned, that was the risk for last week, but that's been explained how that changes as we go forward into the season. And then there's also been cases of new strain BTV8 in southern France and northeast Spain. Next slide, please. So just a message from one of the Defra advisors that visited the Netherlands when the outbreak was there taking place. And he said it's important, his main message is to give to farmers is that the BTV3 in sheep is not anything like the BTV8 that was experienced in 2007. The effect back then was mild in cattle and similarly in sheep with minimal mortality. This in 2023, the case fatality rate recorded in the Netherlands was over 75%. So very different disease. So next slide, please. So the first website we're looking at is from the Dutch Ministry of Agricultural Fisheries, Food Security and Nature. And at the bottom there, you can see there's a map there, which we're going to look at in more detail. So next slide, please. So that shows the cases recorded in the Netherlands as on the 5th of August. The blue dots, and apologies, they are quite small, but that's the map as it is. The blue dots are clinical positive cases are based on clinical signs. The red dots are PCR positives. You'll see there's concentration towards the east to the German border and to the south. But if you look over to the Channel side, there are a few cases getting closer, and obviously those are recorded cases. There may be some, and especially now as the numbers increase, that's getting closer to the Channel. The next slide, please. And obviously there's other Dutch publications, non-government, that also report the increase in bluetongue cases. Next slide, please. So if we look at the situation in Germany, we go to the Friedrich Loeffler Institute, or FLI for short. And at the bottom there's two paragraphs, which I will just pull out and amplify a bit to make it clearer to read. So next slide, please. So they talk there about from July 24 that they started to see an increase in detection of BTV3 cases, and they've now, or up to the 29th of July, they had 800 cases, and they reckon they're going to see a lot more cases and a lot more affected farms over the course of the year. I see they mainly see clinical signs in sheep, but they do find them in cattle as well. Then there's a bit about the vaccines that's now been authorized on emergency regulations and how they're going to use it. But they do then go on to say that although they're authorized, they're not approved, so it can't be used for the facilitate movement of vaccinated animals to BTV-free areas. But obviously that situation will change rapidly as the season progresses. So next slide, please. So if we look at the situation in France, we go to the GDS France website. Next slide, please. Just highlighting that bit there where they talk about June 24, where we started to see cases of bluetongue and epizootic hemorrhagic disease, again in Europe and France. And they mentioned BTV3 in the Netherlands and Germany. They mentioned BTV serotype 8 in France and Spain, and epizootic hemorrhagic disease in France and Spain. And apologies, the acronyms there didn't get translated well by Google Translate, and there may be other words that's been mistranslated as well. But my French isn't good enough to do the translation myself. So, but they also say the disease will continue to spread and infect other areas and expand probably into other countries as well. Next slide, please. So obviously that was written on the 12th of July, and they predicted there that they will get cases, which we've said has now been confirmed. They had their first case. So next slide, please. So they describe a bit about the clinical signs they see, which we know, the pyrexia, the lameness, the crust on the muzzle, ulcerations in the mouth, weight loss, discharge from the nose, and even cases of blue discolored tongues in sheep. And then they do say that, again, animals that do contract the illness will be severely ill, and you will expect to see mortality in sheep and possibly cattle as well. Then they just go on to say that the clinical signs of BTV and epizootic hemorrhagic disease are very similar and cannot be distinguished without laboratory analysis. I think that refers specifically to cattle. Okay, next slide, please. So that is just a map. Unfortunately, I don't have an up-to-date map from the situation in France. So that is 23 season, and the colors there, the green is the BTV8, and then the blue is where they've had BTV8 and episodic disease in the same areas. The pink there or the red would be episodic hemorrhagic disease on its own, and then to the bottom right there, we've got Corsica, where they've had BTV8 and BTV4 cases as well. The next slide. That slide is more recent and shows BTV8, and it says January 24. Unfortunately, I'm not quite clear what time span this covers, but I presume it goes back a while because we probably wouldn't have seen many new cases in January. But you can see where the BTV8 cases are. And again, Corsica to the right there with the orange. The logo is a bit difficult to read, but it mentioned BTV4 and BTV3. Just to keep in mind, the BTV3 strain there is, as far as I'm aware, different to the BTV strain in the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium. But we can see significant numbers as well. And then they go on and talk a bit about the vaccination in France. Keep in mind things move on quickly. So they do mention vaccines are being used in the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium. And they say will be used in France within a few weeks or months. And they talk there about in the event of an outbreak and the vaccination zones. Now, obviously, they've had a case on the Belgian border, which meant they already fell in the 150-kilometer zone. So they already started vaccination, and now they've had one of their own cases as well. And then at the bottom, they mention about that vaccination is still the best protection. They use the word protection there against serotype 3. And we'll just go and look a little bit about what do we understand with vaccine protection and what information the vaccine companies provide. So if we look at the situation in Belgium, we went to the ESA website and they produce these weekly international health monitoring bulletins covering Europe and also Belgium. So if we go to the next slide. And they produce those maps there. So we see the Netherlands there colored because there's a number of cases, but the details there is in Germany and then in Belgium and Luxembourg. And you can see the Belgium cases there, one very close to the border, and same with Luxembourg. And the orange colored ones are from the 1st of June. The red ones is over the past 4 weeks, so the more recent cases, but we can see there's quite a big number, and obviously that is already out of date. It's from a while back, so there's probably going to be a lot more cases. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the Netherlands, one of the studies they've done is they went to these farms that they vaccinated, and they've vaccinated quite a lot. I think with sheep, they vaccinated 80% of the stock or more. Cattle, not quite as many. They focused on the sheep because they were the ones that showed the most severe clinical cases. And they're now starting to get results from this study. So that was from the Friedrich Loeffler Institute, where they give a bit of a summary there. And they start with the information provided by the BTV3 vaccine manufacturers. And they say the use will reduce the clinical signs and viremia following infection with the BTV3 virus. So they don't use the word protection because it's not going to stop disease. It's just going to reduce clinical signs and viremia. Then they go on to say that current reports from the Netherlands indicate the use of the vaccines is safe and well tolerated by sheep and cattle. And as we said, the protection proved not to be perfect. Some vaccinated animals still get clinically ill with BTV3 and some have died. However, important, the infections in the vaccinated animals were much milder overall than in unvaccinated animals last autumn. at the moment, they don't know if there's a difference in the level of protection of the 3 vaccines authorized for use in the Netherlands. There could be, but it's not known at this stage. The other thing is we talk about disease in vaccinated animals, but it could be that these animals contracted or became infected after they only had a single dose or before sufficient vaccine antibody could be built up, so that they maybe got the disease very soon after the 2 doses were completed, so they haven't had chance to be fully immune. And again, they continue to say that at the moment, vaccination is still your effective measure to reduce clinical disease and death from BTV3. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we go to the Netherlands study and their details on the GD website, as we mentioned, they did these studies to look at what the disease do and act on infected sheep farms. So next slide, please. So that was done on behalf of the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, Food Security and Nature, and it was to get a better understanding of what the infection do on vaccinated farms. So they monitored 8 sheep farms and 2 cattle farms, and those farms had BTV3 confirmed. So it started in June 24 and will run until August. And so these are some initial findings that they published on their website. Next slide, please. So they start to say that the clinical picture is completely different from 2023, but then they added to say that it was complicated by high levels of Haemonchus, the blood-sucking parasite. So unfortunately, some of the signs seen with that could look similar to what you would get with blue tongue, with swollen faces. As usual, the cause of the infection is different from one farm to the other. They say despite the vaccination, the number of sick animals increases rapidly, and they talk about sometimes more than half the flock being ill within 2 weeks. Lameness is still the most common clinical sign, but the characteristic mouth lesions appear not to be seen as often as it was in the previous year when they were not vaccinated. So, and the other thing is, they say it's striking that most animals maintain their appetite despite illness, and they usually recover after a few days. And compared to 25, when only about 25% of animals that got infected survived, so only 25%. And a small minority recovered fully after an average of 19 days of illness, so a long period, and mortality averaged 4.5% in infected flocks within the first week after infection, so big numbers. And they go on to say that in 2024, the mortality rates on the sheep farms examined by them were considerably lower, so quite a positive effect from the vaccines. So on the cattle farms, similar in both the 2 farms, again, they saw a sharp drop in milk production and pyrexia. They did see the red noses, saliva, nasal discharge, but in general, the symptoms were milder than last year, with few seriously ill animals and none of the severe lameness that they saw in the previous year. The next slide, please. So in 23, on average, cattle were ill for 22 days. They had many lame animals with severe red swollen coronary bands and lesions on the nose, the mouth, and the udder. And in 24, animals recover relatively quickly, but they still see a lot of new cases popping up on these affected farms. Okay, so just a map from Europe to show the status. Obviously, that's for EU countries, and that's a map from the European Commission. So if we go to the next slide, please. So I think if we look at the green colors there, that shows the countries that are currently disease-free, so they don't have blue tongue. And then the blue colors there is those areas or countries where we've currently got blue tongue disease happening. Obviously, the gray colored countries is not within the EU, so they don't get the color shading. And then it shows some of the islands on the right as well. In Spain, if one can see the colors clearly there, they've got an area that is disease-free, and then they've got also an orange color area that's under an eradication program. But again, that was from the 2nd of August. So as we say, these things can change quite rapidly, and perhaps the disease-free zone in Germany may have changed in the meantime as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so as Leah already mentioned, just a repeat of that, Women's Health and Welfare website, and then obviously the gov.uk website as well for specific government information on and guidance on bluetongue. And okay, I'll stop there for any questions or comments.
Thank you, Rudolf. Yes, so this is an opportunity now to submit your questions, so please pop them in the chat box and we can read them out for you. We've had a few come in so far. So Rudolf, first one is for you. From your research that you've done across Europe, are most of the new cases that are being detected, are they in sheep or cattle?
I don't know. I think sheep are easier spotted because they show the more severe clinical signs, even the vaccinated ones. And as we've seen in the Netherlands, they do record on clinical signs as well. Not everything get confirmed on PCR. So I think in that sense, they probably see more sheep, but I don't know if they're more infected necessarily than cattle.
Thank you. And the Netherlands, the vaccinated animals, are they deemed protective through the placenta?
I don't know that detail. Yeah, I think we'll have to get back about that. So just repeat the question so we got that clearly.
I think this is referring to cows and calf. So if the cows are vaccinated, would the calves also be vaccinated across the placenta, or would they need a fresh dose of vaccination when they're born?
Yeah, I don't have the exact details on that.
That's okay.
I don't think they make any claims for it from memory, but you'd need to look at the individual SPCs. I mean, we do know that they talk about maternally derived antibodies in and not vaccinating young animals because of the potential, but that's from naturally acquired immunity. So, so I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything that can be done to ensure a vaccine is more likely to be effective against new strains that may arrive to future-proof ourselves?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's just, as with any vaccine, obviously it has to go through the appropriate channels to get the correct testing and approval. Obviously, it's sometimes a race against time to try and get there as quickly as possible. And I think that's where it's very good that these studies are being done in the Netherlands, because that's one study where I've mentioned some of the initial findings. But I think the vaccine companies themselves and the authorizing bodies will look quite carefully at some of these responses to their vaccine to see what works best and which vaccine works the best.
Are we talking new strains or new serotypes? I guess is the question, because obviously within BTV8 you've got this slightly more pathogenic strain, and then you've got the different serotypes. And my understanding is that there is no cross protection between serotypes, but what I don't know if we know anything about is the protection within the strains within a serotype. So I think it's about multivalent vaccines, isn't it? I think is the future to give that cross protection across a range of serotypes.
Yeah, okay. What do you think the potential is about us getting a vaccine available in the UK?
So we're currently evaluating the 3 that are available in Northern Europe. The question I think for us is whether we're prepared to permit the use of an unauthorized vaccine, because that's in effect what we'll be doing, or whether we want to wait until there's some more data and evidence and go through the proper authorised route. So, we have the legislative basis to permit the use of those vaccines, as long as we're content that they're safe and efficacious, as long as we understand what they do and what they don't do, and that decision's not been made.
Who is it that makes that decision, Gordon?
So it would be a recommendation by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate to the Secretary of State, and then if that were permitted, if the Secretary of State decided that there were grounds to permit that, it would be down to each administration, so Defra, Welsh Government, Scottish Government, DERA, to decide whether or not to actually license the use of that product in each country, and if they were to license the use, whether it's throughout the whole of the country or under, in zones or whatever. So it's at an administration level.
Great. Okay, thank you. And leading on from that, this is quite hypothetical, but what is the shortest possible time frame that we could obtain approval for a vaccine in the UK, assuming all the testing is successful?
Authorization is typically 7 months to, I think, 2 years in theory, because you stop the clock if you need some more information. We probably need to just double check that with VMD, but that's the sort of time frame.
Okay, thank you. If we are to get cases in the UK, will the same process be adopted for testing as it was last year?
Very unlikely. In fact, the answer is no. We're not going to test everything in the zone, so no.
Okay.
For the early cases, we'll certainly do some surveillance to see whether it's circulating and what the extent is, but we're certainly not going to test every susceptible animal in the zone. We've set out our approach in the framework, and that makes it clear we're not testing everything.
And we can see that framework on gov.uk.
Yep. Yeah, we can.
Yep.
I think it's on the Ruminant Health and Welfare group, but we can post the links.
Great, thank you. If blue tongue arrives in England, are Scotland and Wales likely to close their borders to movements?
I can't answer that question.
Probably a question for Scottish Government, isn't it, and Welsh Government. Are discussions happening currently with Scottish and Welsh Government?
Well, yeah, I mean, disease doesn't. We have regular ongoing meetings and discussions with them. I think the trouble is we're talking hypothetical questions here. It depends on the sets of circumstances. We're assuming that this is going to land on a farm in Norfolk or Kent or whatever, and we're going to find it there. It could pop up anywhere because disease has moved somewhere between hands. So I don't think we can make those sort of state definitively.
That is okay. I have run out of questions. So if there are any final questions, please do pop them in the chat and we will get them asked. Rudolf and Gordon, I just wondered whether you had any final points you wanted to make, or any points to again highlight.
Yeah, I just think. Sorry, Gordon.
Go for it, Rudolf. No, you go for it.
No, just as we said before, with the risk increasing of cases happening, and it, as Gordon said, it may not necessarily be where we think the highest risk is. So just be vigilant and remind yourself of the clinical signs and the route when you do pick up a suspect case. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I was going to say something very similar. It's a very dynamic situation. The actual risk of it blowing across, varies depending on the weather, but it's pretty clear that, disease is widespread in Northern Europe. So there is a very clear threat. And so, please be vigilant, look out for it. Yeah, I know that there's implications, for the first person because that's where the zone happens. But if we leave it undetected, it will spread throughout GB, and so we'll all be worse off. So the earlier that we can detect it, the better we have of slowing its spread, if not totally getting rid of it from that initial incursion.
Great. Okay, thank you. I've not received any further questions. There is, like I said at the beginning, there's a feedback form that will follow after the webinar. So if you think of any questions as we leave, please pop them in the feedback form and we can get them answered and uploaded onto the Ruminant Health and Welfare website. Thank you both, Rudolf and Gordon, for joining us and for your updates this afternoon. And thank you everyone for joining and taking the time out of your day. Just to reiterate, please do fill in that feedback form if you've got a couple of minutes. We would welcome your suggestions, ideas, constructive criticism, anything you've got to say. I just wanted to again signpost to the Ruminant Health and Welfare website for all the latest updates, resources and facts. The BTV hotline 024 77 71 0386 for any further questions or perhaps more personalised questions. One thing I've not included in there is the gov.uk website, which Rudolf, I think it was you that pointed out within your slides. There's lots of information on there as well. And I think apart from saying that the next webinar is due on the 4th of September and that's available to book now, that concludes today's webinar. So thank you again for joining and we'll see you in September. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah.
Bye.